Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our very first engagement for the year as a Democracy Development Program in partnership with the Mail and Guardian. Of course, we today are discussing a very critical part of the ways in which governance is portrayed in our country, but also the ways in which we're able to engage with the policy of the day, engage with the way in which the cabinet, as well as the rest of the government, is going to start to enable mechanisms for governance, mechanisms for ensuring that some of the goals that the country aspires towards is going to be able to implement. So last week we had the SoNA address from the president of the country, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa. And of course, this week we've been engaging, or we've been seeing engagement in Parliament around the SoNA debate itself. So debating the different aspects of SoNA. And today we have with us two very astute guests that you would be familiar with on very many platforms. Some of them have gotten YouTube acclaim, and of course we'll be engaging their various areas of analysis. Before I do an appropriate welcome and just to let you know in terms of structure how we're going to unfold today, let me welcome the executive director of the Democracy Development Program, to welcome you on behalf of the organization, as well as our funders, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Dr. Paul Kariuki.
Thank you so much, Brian. Good morning, friends of DDP and colleagues. Thank you so much for making time to join us this morning for this important conversation. And we believe that you have ideas and your views and opinions based on what you heard from the President's State of the Nation address last week. And we as DDP, our core work is to create platforms such as this, where we can explore ideas and exchange views so that we can be able to hold our leaders accountable for their decisions and for their actions. And we believe in this kind of an arrangement, you are able to express your voice, perhaps in other places where you could not have been able to do so. And so we're thankful that you chose our platform this morning, and we are thankful also for partnering with Mail and Guardian to make this work possible for us as an organization. And so on behalf of our staff team, our DDP board, and our founder, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, we welcome you, and I wish you great deliberations this morning. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kariuki. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've got with us Gok Dungezweni Oprimachikli, who is an independent political analyst. He was a senior research associate at the Center for Policy Studies in Johannesburg until March 2011, and was a research fellow at the Helen Suzman Foundation until December 2016. He was invited to take up a research fellowship at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies. Mashikli is a former mathematics, science, and English teacher, strategist at the Premier's office in Gauteng, as well as former spokesperson for the MEC of Education in Gauteng. He holds a degree in history and English literature. Welcome, Goko. We hope to hear more for you shortly. And then we also have Sanisha Naidu. Sanisha Naidu is a policy analyst, currently is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Dialogue, based at UNISA. She has a master's in international relations from the University of Staffordshire in the United Kingdom. She previously worked at the Open Society Foundation for South Africa and the South African Institute for International Affairs. She's also a seasoned political analyst, and we welcome you, Sanisha, to the platform.
Good morning, Brian, my colleagues, and everyone on the event. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, the program will unfold as follows. We'll have initial input from our two guest speakers for a period of about 10 to 15 minutes each. And in this part of the program, they'll be unpacking for us the initial feedback in relation to SoNA. So to what extent did SoNA meet our expectations? How engaging was SoNA with the lived realities of people wherever we might be, particularly as we find ourselves in a space of a fledgling economy, a significant unemployment, specifically as a result of the various levels of lockdown that we've been under, but also to what extent did we respond to the need for economic revival? To what extent did we engage with the space as far as how aware are we now of what the plans ought to be for dealing with the pandemic as we are confronted with it? So that's going to be the first sort of portion of the engagement. We'd like for you to continue to engage with us on our chat section. We will be launching polls as well at various intervals. Should you experience any challenges engaging with the platform in the next in the next hour or two, please know that we will be emailing a link to the recording itself. But also, you're welcome to share the recording once you've received it with any other colleagues that might need to access it, as the recording itself will be on YouTube. At the moment, you can feel free to start engaging and telling us your initial thoughts on the platform as to what were your initial thoughts and feelings around the State of the Nation address that was provided to us by Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa. Of course, the next two sections of our engagement will unfold as follows. We'll also have an opportunity to engage the panelists on the responses insofar as the political implications of SoNA, as it were. To what extent are the SoNA debates a real gauge as to what level of political competitiveness exists in the country? Do we have real options? Are people engaging for the sake of engaging? Is it just an opportunity to throw shade, as the young people say? Or is there substantive actual engagement that relates to policy development and what the role of Parliament ought to be in that? And then, of course, the last sort of portion where we start to round up our session will be trying to speak to the idea of sort of what do we do in order to become vigilant both as citizens, as institutions, and to what extent can we start holding Parliament more accountable for their role in oversight? Because yes, SoNA is a delivery of what the nature of the country is, but it's from the perspective of cabinet, as it were. So what is the role of Parliament then going forward, and how can we ensure that as citizens, we continue to keep them accountable? I'd like to now welcome Gog Aubrey Machikwi, who will give us the first round of inputs from the panelist perspective. Welcome, Gog.
Thokoza Khetla, and thank you. I would like to start by thanking the Democracy Development Program, the DDP, for once again taking the risk of inviting me to be a speaker at this event. The post-SoNA event is one of my favorite DDP events. In fact, a friend was asking me why. I enjoy going to DDP events, which this year, of course, unfortunately is not taking place in Durban. And I said to him is that at these events, the audience tends to be constituted by real people. The real people the State of the Nation address should be about. Real people with real concerns, problems, worries about their social and economic prospects, how their children will do at school, whether the school feeding scheme will be fully functional and effective. Real concerns in this age of COVID-19 about hunger, unemployment, the malnutrition of young children. Because as you know, in this country, malnutrition is rife amongst children. In fact, stunting as a phenomenon amongst children who are 5 years old is a real problem in this country. I spoke to him about how this audience consists of real people who are women, who represent the feminization of almost everything that ails this country in social and economic terms. And what COVID-19 is showing us is the extent to which women are bearing the brunt of the devastating impact of this virus. I would like to start by repeating what I have said in the past at this post-SoNA event. First of all, I am more interested in the state of the nation than I am in the State of the Nation address. Because the State of the Nation address tends not to be reflective of the true state of the nation. And this State of the Nation address did not deviate from this. But also, I tend to be more interested in the State of the Nation than I am in the State of the Nation address, because words, as I have said in the past, are not always what they describe. And therefore, when I listen to a State of the Nation address, I am looking for evidence that at last the State of the Nation address will bridge the gap between its words, the words that populate the address, and what those words describe. And once again, I found that with this year's State of the Nation address, there was no discernible evidence that the SoNA constitutes a bridging of the gap between the words of the address and the reality it seeks to describe, and therefore ameliorate. I have argued also in the past that there is a very important aspect of the State of the Nation that is never addressed by the State of the Nation address, and that is the spiritual aspect. If we look at our history, one of the things that colonization or colonialism did was to rob us not only in terms of colonizing the mind or colonizing the body, colonizing space, colonizing time, and our relationship with time and space, and our position in time and space. But the colonizer colonized the spirit, which is the essence of what it means to be human. And I find that no State of the Nation address addresses this very important aspect of what it means to be human, and in a narrower sense of what it means to be a South African post-apartheid. But I also found that the president, once again, was full of ideas. But many of the ideas, firstly, were a repetition of ideas that he has shared with the nation before. But also they tend to be ideas that are removed from the concrete reality or the lived reality of our people. If you are a rural dweller, there was very little for you in this State of the Nation address. If you are a woman who, as I said, has to bear the brunt of the devastating impact of the COVID-19 crisis, there was very little for you there. There was very little recognition in this State of the Nation address of the fact that women bear the social and economic brunt, bear the impact of inequality, poverty, and unemployment more than their male counterparts. And we've seen, for instance, that in the economy, to the extent that 2.8 or so million jobs were lost during the hard lockdown, 2 million of the jobs that were lost were the jobs lost to women. And to the extent that some of the jobs have been regained, as we began to relax the lockdown measures, the preponderance of the jobs that have been regained have gone to men and not to women. And therefore, I looked for and I did not find specific measures that address this South African reality, that is the feminization of the devastating impact socially and economically of the COVID-19 crisis. And my chicken agrees. Now, that is not the same as saying that the president did not say anything or anything important. But before I proceed, we must remember that in terms of the National Development Plan, its targets and goals, most if not all of which have been missed, are supposed to bear fruit in 10 years' time. And if you look at the content of the State of the Nation address, there is very little evidence that the key targets of the National Development Plan will be achieved in the next decade. But to some extent, of course, our politicians, particularly the ruling party and the president, are lucky because they can blame it all on COVID-19. Now, on the COVID-19 front, I do think even the most begrudging amongst us must celebrate the fact that the vaccine rollout started yesterday, with the arrival of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Depending on which scientist you listen to, depending on whether you believe the figures that were bandied by the president in the SoNA, and depending on which study you believe, it seems we should expect that by the end of this year, if things go well, we should expect anything between 35 million and 40 million doses. What I found a bit nebulous in the SoNA is the fact that while the president is able to confirm that a certain number of vaccines have been secured, I am still not very clear about the timelines. And therefore, my suspicion is that yes, some progress will be made in the rollout program, but it is highly unlikely that we will be able to vaccinate the 67% of the population that we need to vaccinate to achieve herd immunity by the end of 2020. I suspect, therefore, that even during the first quarter of 2022, we will still be in the middle of that vaccination program. At the end of which, it is not clear by when we can safely say that the population shall have reached herd immunity, which means what we must brace ourselves for is the possibility that the COVID-19 crisis and its impact and COVID-19 itself is something we shall have to live with side by side and get used to living with side by side, maybe for the next 2 to 3 years. On the economy, the president highlighted once again the devastating impact the COVID-19 crisis has had, and highlighted the fact that it is the private sector which must be the driver of job creation in South Africa. The problem, however, is that the possibility that the private sector is going to adopt a holding position. Because if you listen to what business organizations such as BUSA said after the delivery of the State of the Nation address, it is very clear to me that business, particularly big business, was not impressed by what was said by the president. In fact, Moody's fired its shots before the delivery of the State of the Nation address, indicating once again that one of the problems we have on the economic front is the fact that international investors and ratings agencies do not believe what the president says in the SoNA and what the finance minister has said in the past and what he will say next week, because for at least, or since at least 2013, they have heard it all and have not seen demonstrable evidence of an advance towards the structural reforms they and international investors have been demanding. But also, if you look at it from the perspective of the poor, Black Sash has argued that while it is good that the 350 Rand relief measure will be extended by another 3 months, 350 is not enough. They have therefore recommended an amount of about 585 to provide relief. Even that 585 Rand will not be sufficient relief for those who are poor. The president announced that through his presidential stimulus employment program, about 430,000 people have benefited. And at the moment, 180,000 people are being recruited. Now, of course, he did not venture to talk about the of these jobs, because as we try to create conditions for job creation, the quality of the jobs, particularly the quality of jobs held by women, the primary caregivers, given the fact that most children live with their mothers or another female, is going to be critical. Another thing that is critical for the creation of conditions for growth beyond the COVID-19 crisis is the management of state-owned enterprises, particularly Eskom. Now, depending on how you heard the president, he seems to be saying that Eskom is moving towards privatization, partial or otherwise, starting with breaking it up into 3 entities. Or he seems to be saying that Eskom will be broken down into 3 entities, in other words, into 3 public-owned monopolies. Now, when you look also at other things he said about state-owned enterprises, he talked about how overarching legislation for the management of state-owned enterprises will be tabled in Parliament this year, to Cabinet this year and Parliament next year, which makes me wonder whether the ANC under his leadership is not going back to an idea that came about many years ago, the effect of which would be to create a super ministry in charge of state-owned enterprises. If it is his intention to move in that direction, the question is, what kind of internal ANC political battles will ensue as a result? And on corruption, he extolled the advances and achievements that have been made by the criminal justice system. And I want to close on this note of corruption for this part of our discussion. While, as I've said before, corruption, in my view, by the time former President Jacob Zuma exited the union buildings, was no longer endemic, but had become systemic, meaning had become the dominant culture in the state and the private sector. I do think that South Africa spends an inordinate amount of time talking about corruption at the expense of other challenges. In other words, there's an attempt to pretend that it is the main challenge facing South Africa, when in effect, I still insist, the main challenge facing South Africa is inequality. There are, of course, constituencies in this country that are more comfortable with the corruption conversation than they are with conversations about inequality and its impact. And it is not surprising that they are. These are constituencies largely that are benefiting from the inequality, that have benefited from the inequality of the past, and seek to continue benefiting from the inequality of the present and the future, so that there is no re-engineering of the social and economic landscape in this country. And finally, let me say this. As far as state capacity is concerned, the president announced more agencies and creating more structures. And of course, that gives the appearance that our government is doing something. The problem is this: when former President Jacob Zuma came to power, one of the things he did was to re-engineer government departments and other state institutions and create new ministries and other state institutions. The problem with that, given the challenges facing the country, every time we re-engineer state institutions, we are faced with the critical challenge of building capacity for these new institutions, while at the same time, the state is expected to perform optimally. And evidence has shown that our state is weak and lacks the capacity to do both. That is, to create new capacity in the new state institutions that are being created, while at the same time, it is delivering optimally on the needs of South African citizens. Let me stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Kok Aubrey, for those initial thoughts on the subject matter that we're confronted with today. Of course, you make significant challenges around to what extent Cyril Ramaphosa's address specifically address the feminization of the impact of COVID-19 and other challenges and social ills in this country. And I think that becomes a huge talking point moving forward, especially with some work that's been done around establishing groups and spaces for the dealing of violence, dealing with violence against women and so forth. But there is a lot of work that's necessary, specifically in economic terms, to start thinking about what role government needs to actually start doing moving forward. Of course, we have with us Sanisha Naidu, who's going to be giving us her perspective on the State of the Nation address, its impact, its weight in the current circumstances that we're confronted with. But of course, please feel free to continue to respond to our poll. We're going to be closing the first poll shortly. If you haven't had an opportunity to respond, please do so. But also, we do note the questions and comments that are coming up in the chat section. Please continue to engage in the chat section as well. Both as a response to what's being said by the speakers, but also just in terms of what your own thoughts are in relation to the State of the Nation address, the constituency that you serve. Did they feel sufficiently represented with the State of the Nation address? The work that you intend to do this year, are you more hopeful about the type of things that you're going to be able to do as a result of the State of the Nation address, or do you think you have to do it in spite of what was said at the State of the Nation address? And of course, we do welcome Sanisha, who's going to be holding the fort for the next 15 or so minutes. Welcome, Sanisha.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you to Aubrey. I think he always sets a very high platform and very difficult to come and speak after that, but I will definitely try. Firstly, it's always wonderful to be on the DDP platform, and my association with DDP extends way back when I was a student at the University of Durban-Westville. So I've always had a very special place in my heart with DDP and the work that they do. I think it's the closest we come to a kind of civic participation where people, and it's unfortunate that we can't do this face to face, where you can actually have that kind of grounding in a conversation about key structural issues that afflict our democracy and in many ways raise questions, I think, more about where our democratic consolidation is going, or if anything, have we democratically consolidated this democracy? And these questions and these discussions we've been having, I think, has extended over the period of time since DDP was born, its inception. And we've seen that a lot of key thinkers, scholars, but also civil society advocates have come through the ranks of this. And I think what I want to do as a starting point to answer Brian's question and to contextualize my impressions of the State of the Nation address is to say that the expectation was very high regarding what the president was going to say. And more importantly, I think the expectation was this was almost as if this was going to be a defining State of the Nation address for President Ramaphosa. Notwithstanding the fact that he had a whole lot of things to deal with, the fact that we are in unprecedented times with the pandemic, that we have a state of the nation that is in an acute state of crisis, and also because he was fighting battles in his party. And a lot of this hype became part of the kind of intellectual, scholarly debates, but also the kind of media commentaries about how President Ramaphosa is going to deliver a balanced State of the Nation address that could touch on everything, but also come out as if he had a plan. And unfortunately, as Aubrey has said, it was very difficult to find out what that plan was in the State of the Nation address. And I think, you know, one of the things I have to agree with you, Aubrey, is that there was never ever a plan in the State of the Nation address in terms of its years of it being delivered, whether it was in terms of a Mbeki's presentation or whatever. I think a lot of it hinged on what the budget speech will do. And I think that is why the State of the Nation address becomes a more ceremonial speech than a speech that tells us what's the state of the nation. But I think this time around, the president had lost an opportunity in this way, because there was this expectation that the speech would actually find some level in which it would provide, as some of our our participants are commenting in the chat room, some kind of solutions to the crisis. But unfortunately, what President Ramaphosa did was to try and provide a speech that was hopefully trying to win the hearts and minds of the people, but unfortunately did not, because the theme of the speech, or the quote at the end by Maya Angelou around "I Rise," I think was a very, very feeble attempt to say to South Africans, you still have to continue to sacrifice. I know it's just 25 years into this democracy, but people are feeling very lethargic. People are feeling very disconnected. People are feeling apathetic. And I think the people that are constantly at the coalface of the corruption, the bureaucratic inertia, a state that's not delivering, or a government that's not basically delivering, are the same people that you're asking to make the continual sacrifice. And I think that disconnect, whether it's the marginalization of women, the apathy of the youth, the fact that we have children that have stunted growth, the deepening poverty, the deepening inequality, the deepening hunger, is that these are the same people that you are asking to continue to be patient. And that's the disconnect in the speech for me, is that as much as he wanted to present a speech where he spoke about the achievements in terms of the infrastructure development plan, he spoke about his pet project, which is the smart city, which again don't get so much. He spoke about the spectrum auction, etc. A lot of what he said, as I have to agree with, were things that were rehashed from the past. But he didn't say what is the deliverable. And the speech didn't really tell us what was implemented. I think the other disconnect for me was the fact that the president kind of spoke about a South Africa that kind of resides in his mind. And a South Africa that in many ways does not necessarily reflect a South Africa of 2021 or 2020 or going into 2022, but a South Africa that resembled going into 1994, where we were all kind of optimistic and euphoria about a rainbow nation. And I put that in inverted commas. So I think at the end of the day, the speech was really a kind of speech where he thought that this was what he needed to do to build up confidence. And as one media commentator said recently on a radio show, he said, the State of the Nation address is not to create a roadmap or a blueprint, etc. It's to create inspiration. If that was the objective of the speech last Thursday, unfortunately, it didn't do that. Unfortunately, what it did was it spoke to things that disconnected from the micro. It spoke about a macroeconomic situation. It spoke about the infrastructure. It spoke about all of these different things. It talked about the ESCOM structure and how that's going to go forward. But it didn't really talk to what people on the ground are experiencing. And I think that, for me, was the disconnect for President Ramaphosa, that he did not necessarily speak about what is the ordinary challenges and how they're going to deal with those challenges at the coalface of people who are experiencing corrupt municipalities, unspent money from municipalities, poor infrastructure, bad service delivery, people whose infrastructure and roads and sanitation, water, piping, etc., is just not there. People are waiting days, if not weeks, if not sometimes months, for their water and electricity supply to be reconnected. It's not that state of the nation. So he was speaking about a state of the nation which kind of spoke about how he saw things, when in reality on the ground, it wasn't there for most of the ordinary people in South Africa who live in absolute poverty and experience inequality. The second disconnect for me is that he spoke about things that we already knew. He spoke about things that we kind of understood that it was there, they were working on it, but he never amplified it. So, for example, we couldn't really see what he meant by talking about this kind of infrastructure program, and we're going back to the infrastructure spend, etc., etc. How that's going to actually help the ordinary person on the street. Yes, we know having connections, having the spectrum auction happen, etc., is all very important for faster internet and so forth. But it doesn't talk to the fact that even if you have faster internet, we have serious constraints with pricing in this country around how expensive internet is, how expensive the access to broadband and so forth is, and the collusion by the companies in this in terms of competition. And so in the year that passed, there was collusion by companies that actually priced people out of the market in terms of the way in which collusion took place. And so there was a need to address that. Yes, we have a competition commission that deals with this, but unfortunately, these are not going to be resolved because the inflation hasn't really gone up, but it doesn't get more money in people's pockets. People are poorer now than they were before. And so he never spoke to the reality of what's in people's pockets, what's on people's tables. He kind of spoke as if this is where we're going to go and everything's going to be quite nice, warm, and fuzzy. And I think that disconnect kind of turned people away around the fact that if you look at the HSRC survey done with UJ, you're finding a correlation between people are actually looking at the politics of the country and the state of the country in terms of the state of the nation, and they're saying, well, I don't have confidence in whether I want to take the vaccine or not. So they're not equating it to the science of the vaccine. They're actually saying, what is this government doing for us? And maybe this vaccine is just one avenue that we're going to see more corruption, we're going to see more collusion. And they're equating this politics of the state to how they're perceiving certain key deliverables within the state. Again, what was missing in the speech, and I think we're talking a lot about the expectation and purpose and context, is that the speech happens in a context where the economy contracted by 7.5%. How do you get back from that base, bearing in mind that before COVID happened, we were already in a technical recession? Bearing in mind that the industries that you're talking about with master plans, your automotive industry, your sugar industry, they are very small employers. How are you going to create the kind of employment that is sustainable for a medium to long term? How are you going to integrate the youth? I think leaving a lot of the speech was leaving things to other people to take on in a much more substantive way. And that was the missing middle for me in this speech, that the substantive nature of the speech was left to the cabinet or the ministries, etc. And again, on energy renewal, I'm very worried. I mean, I agree with you, Aubrey, that we're not sure where this is going. Is this a super ministry and the tensions that this will propose? But again, we're going to end up with more bureaucratic inertia about the renewable energy, the 5-window period for renewable energy that was supposed to go on sale. And again, you're kicking back things to Parliament to expedite. We're not sure how Parliament is going to expedite certain issues. And then when you come to these agencies, an agency, a panel, another kind of what you call this reform program around agrarian restructuring, we have so many of these institutional spaces that we need to keep. I mean, I take the point you make, Aubrey, that you say that we talk about corruption a lot, but we also try to think that everything needs to be done through an institution. And this creates a drain on the resources of the state when we already know what the problem is, what the prognosis is, and what needs to be done. I'm not sure why we need more institutions to deal with corruption, why we need an institution to deal with what needs to be agrarian reform, why we need a kind of institution to deal with the whole question of land reform and so forth. So again, I think what came out very clearly was that the president was trying to balance off a speech, but in balancing the speech, there was very little solutions offered around where we are going, what we are doing, and how we are going to do it. Now, lots of my friends say to me, Sanisha, no, that's not what the focus or the nature or the scope of a State of the Nation address is. He's supposed to just talk about what was the year past and how to go forward. Unfortunately, he could have actually been much more innovative in the speech and said, let's buck the trend. Let me defy conventional wisdom. And let me say that I'm going to set up some key targets. Now, it's not enough to say that you've signed performance agreement contracts with the ministers. It's all up on the internet. You can see it on the presidency website and so forth. Tell the people how you're going to basically address KPIs for ministers. So if the minister doesn't necessarily perform, what are you going to do? It may end up in the same situation that the ANC finds itself in, where you ask somebody to step aside, but then there's labor laws that says you can't do this. So again, we kind of looking at these kinds of institutional things that he says we're going to do, we have done, we will do. But when it comes to implementation, it's very thin on the ground. And I think the idea that this State of the Nation was to basically inspire was not necessarily one that could have been done. I think what would have been very nice is if he just came back and said, we didn't do what we were supposed to do. Yes, COVID-19 was there, but unfortunately, we were sitting with this before COVID-19 came in. The last point I want to make is the speech was really thin on foreign policy. In fact, I think the only reference to foreign policy was the question of saying, we signed the ACFTA, we're going to implement it, and if that's the Continental Free Trade Agreement, it's going to basically enhance trade. But again, you were the chair of the African Union. You were sitting in the UN Security Council on a 2-year non-permanent membership basis. And I'm not sure. I mean, there were some wins there to take. For example, South Africa, together with India, have been advocating aggressively in WTO for a temporary waiver on intellectual property patents and property rights regarding the vaccine, which will then make it easier for poorer countries, developed countries, and African countries to be able to access the vaccine freely, fairly, and equitably. That's a gain for South Africa at the global level. And it shows South Africa's advocacy. So I think those were some of the issues that could have come out. And I know that many people argue, oh, the State of the Nation is not for only foreign policy, but it's more about domestic thing. But I think these were important gains that could have come out. And the final point I want to make, if you bear with me, Brian, for about 20 seconds, is I think everything is now left to the budget speech. everything now hinges on what the finance minister is going to say. And unfortunately, the impression I also got from the speech is that it seems to me that National Treasury now is not necessarily checks and balances on spending or everything. It's more like an implementing agency, and that also is not good as signs for foreign investors coming in. And whether or not foreign investment intention is the same as transactional investment for the investment facility. So I think these are discussion points we could have in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanisha. I think that's a very good sort of starting point or segue into our Q&A section, as both you and Aubrey were able to speak about. To a large extent, he seems to leave, or at least the speech left too much to other cabinet ministers, other role players in this, without giving us sufficient insight as to what the actual plan is from his perspective as the leader of that government, as the first citizen of the country. Now, when we look at, I'll be going through shortly the questions that are in the Q&A box, but I just wanted to have a touch base on this specific subject. So this is similar to the discussion that's been had over the past couple of months relating to the role of the so-called family meeting, and to what extent the president himself should be available to engage with any questions that might come up from the media, from citizens as a result of what he had just said in that moment, and to address it as freshly as possible. Because the truth of the matter is, the extent of coverage that a president's speech gets is somewhat different from what you would get from a cabinet minister, for instance. We know that shouldn't be the issue, but people only have probably 8 hours in a day to actually engage both with work, but also to start to keep abreast with what's happening in government and participate in that space. So should we be asking more both of SoNA, so a redesign, a rethink, particularly when we look at the fact that even from an aesthetics point of view, this year was completely different because of COVID-19, and sort of all of the fringe stuff was actually removed. And we had it was clear, it was short, there was no fancy stuff aside from the lighting the candle, which is fine. But beyond that, to what extent should we be asking more of both the head of the state, as it were, and the type of inputs that he's able to make into these different spaces, and then what becomes the supporting role of cabinet as a result of what the head of state would have said in that. I don't know if Aubrey, you want to address that first, and then we'll go back to Sanisha. If you could put your mic on, you've muted yourself, Gok. Sanisha, you can go for it whilst Gok was getting ready.
Yeah, I mean, I think the State of the Nation is that kind of ceremonial and that kind of, like, for me personally, it's a speech that everybody looks forward to at the beginning of the year. Not because you have the red carpet and the razzmatazz that happens at the red carpet, but it's about the fact that you eagerly wait to hear where you are going to be situating key issues for the year in terms of the speech that then leads to the parliament formally opening and so forth. I think cabinet ministers provide more substance to what is a issue that the president would raise. So obviously not all of us, not all South Africans are going to listen to a cabinet minister speak, etc. Now, if you take the family meeting, and he keeps, when the president talked about different lockdown measures and what the different lockdown regulation measures would be, and how the different ministries, and in particular led by the COCTA minister, the Minister of Corporate Affairs and Governance, Traditional Affairs and Governance, would actually outline it. I'm not sure many people went back and looked at it, but a lot of it was then disaggregated into nice, neat-sized, bite-sized factual sheets, which then you could digest. I think for me, this State of the Nation address was supposed to be something that was going to basically try and do something different. And I think he had the opportunity to do that. Ordinary people would have actually wanted to listen to the president to say, not this language of we will, we should, we would, not that kind of language, not those kinds of rhetoric, but rather a more decisive, actionable language that needed to come out. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. And because that didn't happen, I suspect if we look at some polls today and we see people being asked, did in terms of did you watch the State of the Nation address, firstly? Secondly, at what point did you switch off your TV or your radio because you had other things to do, or did you really go through the whole speech itself? I'm sure people basically just became kind of apathetic. I mean, for me, I kind of lost the president at times because I was trying to figure out where you're going here with all of these things that you've mentioned. I know it's not an easy task to be a leader of a country like South Africa. It's difficult. You could see strain on his face. But at the end of the day, I think it was a question of saying, I needed to be decisive. And this is a speech where he could have been decisive. And that decisiveness would have put the ministry and the ministers and the cabinet in terms of where they needed to be. I mean, one of the things that needed to be much more clearer is taking those 4 priority areas that he set out in the beginning of the speech and actually just kind of hit 2 or 3 key areas, key points that needed to be raised and say, this is what we're going to do. This idea that the president says, oh, we're going to have a spectrum auction, but it'll have to be resolved because there's some legal issue there. He needs to be decisive because he needs to tell ICASA, get your act together. He can't say to us in the State of the Nation address, public officials need to get their act together or else they're going to be leaving. Because at the end of the day, you can't teach ethical leadership. It has to come through in terms of the appointments you make at the local government level, at the provincial level, and within your cabinet. And so some of these individuals that are sitting there are not necessarily being carrying out their KPAs in the way that they should be carrying out. Now, you can't keep fiddling with things and saying, let's put a commission here, let's expedite legislation there, etc. Because at the end of the day, you're still not addressing the root crisis of the challenges we have in this country: the poverty, the inequality, the deepening unemployment crisis, a youth bulge that is becoming exceptionally apathetic, early childhood development where he made a lot of announcements on it, but he never really speak about it in a critical, in a substantive way in the speech. So there was things that he needed to say, and of course, if I remember correctly, and I stand corrected here, I don't think he even mentioned anything about the grade 12 matric results, or said that they're going to come out, or he's going to say something about what happened there as well. So we're sitting in a very difficult position where my point is that we had 8 months for certain ministries to get it right, and they didn't get it right. So why did we have these lockdown measures? In order to ensure certain institutional architecture needed to be transformed. If you look at the basic education system, again, public schools are still sitting with enormous ratios to teachers in terms of learners to teachers. That hasn't been resolved. Some of these schools haven't really been transformed in terms of becoming COVID compliant. So we need to understand where this is all going. And of course, one of the other things, and I see there's a person from Black Sash at the event, attending the event, and that is, would it be interesting if you spoke about a basic income grant? So I'll leave it there for
yeah. Thank you so much, Sanisha. Dr. Kopri, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that the president has never left the CODESA negotiating room. And it seems to me that there is a very big gap between his belief in social compacting and the reality of social compacting as one of the means by which we can bring about change cooperatively in this country. And when I listened to the response of the DA for the first time, well, not for the first time in a long time, I agreed with the DA. John Steenhuisen argues that the State of the Nation address was littered with many a promise for one kind of reform or another. But what has been lacking in the past is that while announcements have been made in previous SoNAs regarding reforms, these announcements have not been changed into a legislative agenda that Parliament should look at. And that brings me to another point, that when we look at the SoNA, we should next week look at it in relation to the budget. Because when you look at the actual budget allocations for the promises that have been made, that's when you get a real sense of whether the promise is well made or not. And therefore, when we look at the budget next week, we should answer a question I've had since 1994. Is the budget the tail that wags the SoNA dog? Is National Treasury the tail that wags the state? Because if the answer to these questions continues to be yes, there is an extent to which both the SoNA and the budget speech betray a particular tendency. The tendency to be plutocratic in approach, and therefore be concerned more about the desires of the wealthy at a global and domestic level. So while about 700,000 families in South Africa benefit from one grant or another, social grant or another, and while that is good, because the alternative is a popular revolt and revolution, the fact that so many families are receiving one kind of social grant or another signals some of the deep gaps we see in this SoNA and previous SoNAs. So yes, you are right, Brian. The president gets a lot of media mileage through the family meetings. And maybe you have stumbled on an idea there. To the extent that the SoNA cannot contain all that we need to hear, maybe beyond the ministerial briefings, the president should not restrict himself to COVID-19 related family briefings. Maybe he should extend the family briefings or family meetings to deal with aspects of the promises that were made in the State of the Nation address.
Definitely. I think what's been interesting for me in looking at the sort of political environment across the world, and when you look at the way in which President Biden in the US has sort of gotten to grips with the fact that he's having to do a lot of reforms and instituting a lot of different policies that were different from his predecessor, for instance. It puts the country somewhat at ease to have someone who's constantly engaging with them on the platforms of the briefings that they're having. Why is it not possible, for instance, for us to emulate or start to do something similar for President Ramaphosa? Because why did we have to wait for COVID-19, the pandemic, in order to be in a space where we're engaging constantly or engaging somewhat in intervals that we can predict, in intervals that we can plan for from the cabinet's perspective, insofar as what is the work that cabinet is currently undertaking, and what input should ordinary citizens should be having in that space. And of course, the US system, they say, is much more older, much more well developed than ours, but I think it's just also a case of political will in a lot of these instances, whether we're actually willing to bring on citizens to come along with us on journey of governance and so forth. Sanisha, I think were you raising your hand?
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible idea, because I mean, you know, he used the family meetings in a way to see the kind of side of him that I think normally presidents tend to not show in the public domain. which was fine. I mean, not everybody agreed with the family meetings, let's be honest. Everybody thought at times that there needed to be also interaction, Q&A, more Q&A in terms of not just delivering an address for 20, 30, 40 minutes, but rather to have some interaction both with media and of course with ordinary people. But it also means there's another undercurrent to this whole thing, and how much does the party allow him this flexibility to do this in terms of this other debate that became what John Steenhuisen raised, if I could use that as a point of departure for what Aubrey was saying about the reaction of political parties, what John Steenhuisen raised as this kind of very, very destructive link between party and state. Which is very difficult to disconnect at times. So I think there's this, I would definitely think that if the president is able to provide these kinds of mileage in terms of getting these family meetings going and expanding on key promises or key issues in the State of the Nation address throughout the year as an update of where we are, what we have achieved, what we are doing, what are the issues. It's wonderful theoretically and it can be done. But then does the party then become almost obsolete? Because one of the challenges for him, for the party, is nobody is greater than the party. No personality should be greater than the party. And that has been a key undercurrent to the party's internal politics. You just got to look at this whole question of the NEC meeting this weekend, the question of Ace Magashule, the question of former President Jacob Zuma, the State Capture Commission, the defiance. Tomorrow is the court hearing for the Secretary General. The Secretary General being very bold in his statements to say the Constitution is not sacrosanct. So I think to a large extent, there's also that issue about whether the party will see him as becoming greater. And there's an IJR poll that was done, a survey that was done to look at the popularity of the party and this in terms of the preceding the State of the Nation address. And it's very interesting because you look at popularity of President Ramaphosa. This was done, I think, last year, the year before. It's around about 57%, or just under 60%, or just over 55%. And you look at that, and you look at the same question, it's the same percentage. And I'm wondering whether the people that say that they identify with the ANC is that they identify with Ramaphosa as opposed to identifying with the party. Now, there's a difference there, because that is a key issue for them in the 2019 election. Why did the ANC do so well? Was it because Ramaphosa was the issue there? So I think to my mind, that kind of governance issue that exists within the party and these internal dynamics of the party are key issues that prevent sometimes the president from doing what I think he ideally would like. I also think that he's sitting in a nostalgic time capsule, because he thinks this is the South Africa of pre-94, and he was the negotiator, and these are the conditions, and this whole thing is about he doesn't want to be seen as what you call this as aggressive. He wants to be as a consensual president, a consensus-built approach. But he also believes that the social compact will bring the private sector to the context. If you listen to Black Leadership South Africa and the CEO of Black Leadership South Africa, she says there are a number of other companies that are not certain about their investment in South Africa. There are those that have come out openly and said they won't be able to invest. But this 20% tax that's imposed on the import bill so that you can stimulate localization and procurement at the local level, it doesn't sit well with a country like China, because China doesn't really look at that. So what's the trade-off between the investment that comes into South Africa and this whole thing around building up your industrial capacity base around localization and procurement? And how do you become competitive in an economic model that essentially now needs to be rethought because it's not sustainable for long-term growth?
Thanks, Sanisha. Paul, So both Gok, Aubrey, and Sanisha started off their addresses by talking to like significant portions about the type of constituency that they've noted DDP being engaged with, the civil society organizations, real people on the ground, and vastly representative also of females and women in particular. When we look at the polls and the results thereof, the first two ones that we had, the first question we had asked was, to what extent did SoNA speak to the reality of your lived conditions? In that poll, we only had about probably 40% say there was somewhat of a representation of their living conditions. Only 7% of that 40% saying that they are significantly represented by what was being said at SoNA. And then, of course, we had an overwhelming number of about another 37% saying they didn't feel represented at all. And then, of course, when we talk about the confidence levels, based on SoNA, how confident are you that the government has an effective plan for tackling corruption and maladministration? Overwhelming 81% of people responded and said they don't feel confident that government has a plan for those things. Speak to us briefly about what your thoughts are around specifically engaging in the run-up or even post-SoNA. What level of engagement do you hope for with civil society, with your constituencies and other organizations of that nature? And why do you think going forward it will be important for government to onboard these poll results as part of their governance going forward? Nomzana, your mic is off.
All right. Yes, I think these poll results do show the great extent to which the public has been disaffected by the things that they've been exposed to since the pandemic really got the hold of the country, and even before then, because majority of the things that have really caused the disaffection and kind of reduced public trust in the ability of the state to deliver on its missions and its promises have always been existing even before the pandemic really did hit. What the pandemic did is to expose the weaknesses that the state has embraced over the years and kind of become that proverbial ostrich of hiding its head in the sand and resisting or being in denial that these things need to be tackled and be addressed decisively so that we can bring back that ability of trust and even enable the citizens to support state's program in addressing the very issues that are really plaguing them. So that's the first part, I think, is an indication from these results that we're seeing right now. The other element I would like to speak to is the president did mention about a critical aspect that has been part of his last two speeches, and that is rationalization of local government. And now the intent is excellent and it sounds good on paper, but in practice, it is a big challenge, because what the president failed to let us know is how he's going to maneuver the difficulties of cadre deployment from his own party. What are the kind of contours he is willing to trade off to make professionalization of local government possible? Because we know it's not just bringing in expertise, it's issues around behavioral and attitudinal change. It is well documented that majority of citizens get traumatized when they think they have to go to any public office for any service. Apart from the cues, the attitude that receive, it is not something that wants to make you to want to go back there again. And so it flies in the face of the public to say that by fixing the technocrats, the services will be improved. Public service delivery will be efficient. It is not, in my view. And I think this is where, as citizens, we come in to make sure that the talk is translated into action. But the action need to also be placed into context. Firstly, draw back and say, I'm willing to confront my own party, for example, and talk about the complex issue of cadre deployment that has created some of the problems that we see in the local government space. Secondly, talk about how we're going to shift attitudes towards citizen-centeredness. In the same way, private sector do prioritize customer experience for every service that they provide. I think the state can do better than that. I think it can be able to engage more and find out from citizens themselves, how does good service from a public office look like? Because at the moment, it's top-down approach. The government thinks it knows what citizens want. The government thinks that it knows what good service looks like from a citizen's point of view. How about inversing that? Ask the ones who receive the service, how does public service look like from our perspective? And so going back to that notion that I think is very profound, that Ugogo Aubrey shared about changing the perspective of the family meeting, talking more about the issues that do plague citizens on a daily basis, and use family meetings to say, this is what I'm trying to get, and engaging them. Not just talking to them, but talk with them and open up spaces for engagement, even live, because it's a powerful strategy to have access to the nation at any one point for more than an hour to talk about things that they really care about. I believe that if it changes the model, perhaps we can start seeing the rebuilding of the of trust in the first place, and secondly, making citizens feel heard, because at the moment it is the way around, the other way around. They don't feel heard, and they don't feel that their aspirations are taken seriously to reflect in policy decisions and other acts of governance. And the last point I would like to bring in there is also to talk about how does he intend to bring other political parties in co-governing to address the same issues that he's trying to confront. Political parties since the SoNA address have been, of course, poking gaps to what could have been expected to be spoken about, and the majority leaned towards that it was the same rehearsal rhetoric that they have had before and everything that goes with it. How about changing that tactic and managing the political fallout, perhaps with his own party, should he choose to do what is not normally done, and that is to engage them on the very things that he's trying to fix? We cannot be in this together, that kind of a phrase, but decisions are unilateral. Yeah, okay. And that complicates his ability to fast track implementation, and the clock is ticking. The fact that very soon we're going to be having polls for local government and thereafter national elections and provincial elections, there is not so much time left to still try to build legacy projects. Smart cities, for example, are good, but what do we do about the ones that are damaged and non-functional? I will leave it there for now.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kariuki. I think before we go on to the next segment of our discussion, the segment around the role of the SoNA debate and what level of contestation we're seeing in the political realm, I think Paul is somewhat on it. But let's go to the question on the question box, Q&A on the chat section rather. Nomfundo Kubega had asked, how do we then foster accelerated and effective talks on minimizing the level of inequality? I think one of the statements that you had talked about was around the significant emphasis that's being placed on corruption at the expense of other issues that we're confronted with in the country. So in relation to that, Nomfundo was asking, how do we foster accelerated and effective talks on minimizing the level of inequality? I think Sanisha, you had already responded to a bit to a question that Guy Harris had also spoken about in respect of why so little emphasis on early childhood development, for instance, in the SoNA address. So we could start with you, Gogo, on the fostering the accelerated and effective talks on minimizing the level of inequality. Gogo. Okay, so I think Ukoko might not hearing me. Sanisha, do you have some thoughts on this specific one?
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of studies that have been done around how do you minimize the effects of inequality, poverty, etc. You've got academics at UCT. You've got the I think there's a Poverty Studies Institute led by Isabel Fry. There's civil society groups like Black Slash who have all made submissions both to Parliament and to government around the inequality issue and the gap around inequality. I mean, for me, the problem is, or the challenge of the inequality is dealing with the way in which spatial organization takes place, but not just spatial organization. It's dealing with the fact that inequality is not just between class groups; it's also intergenerational. And being intergenerational means that, a student of mine said to me when I was teaching at UCT, he said, Sanisha, I will never be able to buy a place afford a place in, say, Camps Bay, because I'm just starting off from a very disadvantaged position. And then the idea that the market determines the price of everything just escalates and prices people out of any kind of purchasing power. And that for me is the bigger question around how do you deal with everything that needs to be defined within a kind of market-led approach, which doesn't necessarily take into account this context of a social compact. I think the compact that the president is talking about is what you're seeing in NEDLAC, labor, business, government, and so forth coming together. But at the end of the day, the market is determining a lot of this inequality. The market is determining what people's purchasing power is like. And to a large extent, I don't know how you're going to actually get the private sector to kind of self-correct the market, because if the market is doing everything, then people are constantly going to be not on the basis of being able to mitigate the effects of inequality. They're constantly playing catch up. And the moment they try to catch up to the next quintile of their household income, they still then have another big leap to make to the next quintile and the next quintile. And so the cost of university, the cost of everything doesn't make sense, because the way the market is calculated, the way the structure of the market is framed, it's always framed in a disadvantaged way. The trickle-down effect doesn't work. That is why what I find really disturbing about the economic model that we are following in the world over is that we're trying to fit growth, or we're trying to fit the way we're changing our understanding of the economic model into a growth-led approach. The contradiction for the president in terms of the economic model in South Africa is it's an export-led growth model. So it's dependent on consumption elsewhere. If you're looking at the Danny Roderick piece on how government capacity can be the fallback in terms of the fact that nothing in terms of austerity or whatever, government was quite happy about that report from Danny Roderick, because what he was saying in that report is that you can actually central banks don't have to be the kind of austerity. If you have capacity in the state, you can go forward, and of course you have all of that. South Africa doesn't have the capacity. There's nothing to fall back on. The capacity within our state is weak. The capability of the state is weak. So at the end of the day, that's what's influencing this kind of investment-driven model. So you're banking on the big investment coming in. But what you should be doing is that to address the inequality, get the SME sector right. Get that ministry sorted out. Make sure that those economies that are at the subnational level, at the micro level, the people that are basically entrepreneurs and willing to be entrepreneurs and willing to go forward, support them. Stop giving the tax breaks to the big companies. Give the tax breaks to these small. Give them. We see the emergency or the tourism skills fund or the tourism fund, but then who's going to get it? That's where the disconnect comes in for me.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sanisha. So we'd like to move on to the next segment of our discussion. And as I had spoken about earlier, we're going to try and talk to the sort of political implications of SoNA, as it were. And to lead us into that segue, Gorko, we'll start with you, and then we'll have Sanisha to give your thoughts on this one. So to get us into that space of thinking about that is Edward Keenan Jacobs' comment in question in the chat box. He says, in light of the ANC's inability to ameliorate many of South Africa's structural problems, why do you think many people refuse to vote for the opposition parties? Only 49% of the voting age population actually cast a vote in 2019 general elections, of which only 28% voted for the ANC. Many voters therefore seem to be abstaining from elections rather than voting for a party other than the ANC. Why do we think that this is the case? And of course, for us and for the purposes of our discussion, how have the SoNA debates been? Have they been showing us how great our opposition party environment or our political party environment is? Or have we been disappointed by the types of engagement and the levels of critique that we've been receiving as a result of this? Gogo, what are your thoughts?
Well, Brian, I think one of the first things I must do is to remind the ruling party about what the goals of its national democratic revolutions are. First of all, we must bear in mind that the struggle against apartheid colonialism was about creating a society that in social, economic, cultural, and other terms would be the antithesis of apartheid society. But that itself would not be the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal, in the end, is to continue creating a society that itself is the antithesis of this society, which has become the antithesis of apartheid society. And in a sense, that is an ongoing goal. And therefore, when I look at, for instance, the SoNA, the budget speech, and other policy statements, one of the questions I ask is, to what extent does this take us closer to that goal? Now, when it comes to elections, we must ask the same question. To what extent have elections since 1994 taken us closer to that goal? And I would say, especially from the second decade of our democracy, elections have not done that. It is therefore not surprising that in 2019, in the general election, 18 million South Africans who are eligible to vote did not vote. For me, this is not just mere apathy. There may be some among them who are apathetic, but I think this is what we see here are citizens expressing a lack of confidence in the capacity of elections to deliver a better life and to deliver change. Therefore, what they are protesting against when they stay away from elections is the narrow electoralism that has characterized our politics. As I say, especially from the beginning of the second decade of our democracy. So if you look at it this way, the question of an alternative to the ANC does not even arise, because what these potential voters who stay away from elections tell us is that the system is sick. The political system itself is sick, not just the electoral system. The political system itself is sick. And therefore, they do not have confidence in the components of this sick political system, including the political parties, including opposition parties that are part of this sick political system. And therefore, it seems to me that we need to go back. We need to remind ourselves of what the struggle against apartheid was about, and be honest about the fact that, firstly, the liberal democratic model itself is sick. And within it, therefore, our political system is sick. And therefore, elections, as part of that, have failed to deliver the better life that many South Africans had hoped for. Hence, 18 million of them, and maybe more, in 2024, stayed away from the 2019 general election.
Thank you very much, Gogo. Sanusha, what are your thoughts in relation to the sort of political landscape in the country? How responsive have political parties been to the real issues of SoNA And to what extent are we hopeful that Parliament is going to continue to exercise its oversight role as a result of this?
Yeah, I think, as Aubrey said, it has to do with both the model, the way elections are conceptualized in the country, and it's the fact that it doesn't give you direct participation. I think only in the local government election you are able to directly vote for the candidate or the person that you think is most competent. But that too is also flawed, because it's about the party list and how the party list defines itself in that way. But for me, the challenge is, when people stay away from the polls, it's actually a protest vote in a way. It's a protest vote to say, I am not happy. I don't think you have the capability or the credibility to govern, and therefore I stay away. And by staying away, it doesn't necessarily change the status quo because of the PR system we have. So political parties conceptualize their campaigns more along the lines of how much vote they can capture, how much of the electorate they can capture. And often what happens, as we saw in 2019 and we saw in the 2016 local government election, is that if you look at the 2016 local government election, the EFF did very well, because one of the things that emerged out of there was that a lot of the people who were dissatisfied at the community level with maybe ANC run municipalities or whatever said, I will move towards the EFF, and that was a protest vote. But at the same time, people who stay away from the polls and don't go out to vote, they are protesting in one way or form, but it doesn't mean that changes the status quo of who actually gets the majority vote to become ruling party or the governing party in power. That's because the PR system essentially masks the real frustrations of people on the ground. It masks the fact that people are able to say, I don't want to vote, but it doesn't really hurt the political party because the PR system is designed in that way not to hurt the political party in some way. The other thing that we have to look out for very much now is this whole ruling by the Constitutional Court around the idea of allowing independent candidates to contest the election for 2024. I think Parliament is going to be deliberating that. They have about less than 2 years to do that, or just about 2 years. The Electoral Court will have to think about it. The IEC will have to consider what the frameworks and the architecture will be around and how it will be managed. But the challenge with that, again, is we don't have any kind of fail-safe measure to say that when a person votes for you or votes for Paul or votes for Aubrey, and that person doesn't live up to the expectation, that you as the voter can actually have the power to remove them or have the power to say, I don't want you to come in there. We run the risk very often of seeing what happened in the US elections, not in the way that we see Trump used the US elections as a political tool to incite, but we run the risk that people become frustrated. And so you can end up with these kinds of storming of the Bastille approach to what's happening. The other issue for me that's very concerning is that democracy it may be a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient one. And very often the interpretation of democracy is that it's the best thing to any other system of government. The problem is that democracy becomes inherently a threat to itself. And that's what we're seeing. So the liberal model of interpretation of democracy is now being unraveled throughout the world. But it's election by ballot box in terms of how you manipulate the ballot box. And the fourth thing is resources. Who has money to contest an election? I'm very interested to see what the Political Party Funding Act will do in terms of limiting who can fund what. We know it's 100,000 external funding, etc., etc. But there are different ways in which you can actually get through the system. You can manipulate the system in terms of funding. So how will this hurt political parties in South Africa? I don't know. So people don't go out to vote because they are essentially frustrated. But it doesn't mean that it affects the political party. Yes, the numbers reduce. But if we have first past the winner post model, it still means that the party will decide who will be the president, who will be the deputy president, who the cabinet is, etc. It's not direct. I think maybe there's a need to to go back to the Van Zyl-Slabbert report and see where we can find that mixed system come into play. But also there may be the idea that people will say, well, if I vote or I don't vote, things still stay the same. Opposition parties are not changing their tact. Their tact is really how much can we capture from the ANC. ANC basically is saying how much we can retain. And you saw this in terms of the DA in the Western Cape, in the national elections as well. For this local government election, I think that as much as we run the risk of a low voter turnout because of COVID conditions, and because political parties may not be able to do the traditional lobbying and launching of election manifestos as the IEC Electoral Act prescribes, we may end up in a situation where we see a lower voter turnout for a variety of reasons, but it will not necessarily change in terms of who may actually come into play. I think we may see coalitions come into play. This is where smaller political parties have a better traction in local government election, and you have to look at the Western Cape, look at people like Truman Prince, etc., who become big men in small political spaces.
Thank you, Sanisha. So those are very definitely interesting insights, and I think it echoes a lot of what we had already started speaking about. That the space for consultation, whilst available, is not necessarily being used sufficiently. And of course, the model that we're engaged with insofar as elections and public participation, they themselves also have to be significantly revamped and improved in order to better serve the citizens overall. Roger Arunsa says in the chat box that we've been, the speakers, yourselves, have been so far helpful in highlighting the disconnects, which inspired little. Just as the President SoNA, opposition parties simply add to the misery, as they are more opportunistic and less concerned about them. They concern themselves less about South Africa and citizenship and well-being, but they are more concerned about their own political powers. So for us, in rounding up our discussion for today, the last segment of our conversation is about what is the continued vigilance that's necessary from citizens to hold the cabinet accountable, to hold Parliament accountable in its oversight role, but also just in terms of citizen movements like the DDP, like other organizations that have been significantly helpful in doing the work over the past couple of years in the lead up both to the end of what was called the 9 wasted years, but also in building citizen capacity to engage with the issues at the core. Roger says, what may be required of cross-sectional active citizens movement to campaign for genuine change in our country? We spoke earlier about the need for things that could be tracked from the SoNA speech. What should we be asking more of in order to be able to be in that space where there's actual advocacy on things that were determined as deliverables from the president? Let me start with you, Paul, and then we'll go to Sanisha, and Gok Aubrey will run us off for the session.
Okay, I think it's time for us as citizens, and especially civil society, to rethink critically about our own role in getting to a place where we can hear a SoNA speech that really do speak to the aspirations of citizens, because we are on the ground. And perhaps maybe one of the things we should start thinking about going forward on our own before the President SoNA, and take stock of what has been promised before, what has been done, and what we're expecting. And from there kind of start a tracking mechanism on seeing where are the gaps and how do we use a citizen SoNA to start addressing the deficits of the President SoNA. So as a starting place, I think we need to be bold and start doing something like that, which will mean on a practical level, a more coordinated effort from the civil society to be able to do this collectively, so that it's not left to an organization to independently spearhead that kind of a collective effort. However, it's also important to recognize that we, in the meantime, our role is to remain watchful on what government has promised, to ensure that promises do translate actually into actions. It's good to say about many things of what the government would want to do for us and all those things. But if they do not translate into action, we remain in a state of despondency and hopelessness. And I think we won't let that happen. We need to continue this kind of engagements, but also take this level of engagement to the ears of those who need to hear them most: political parties, policymakers, legislatures, and constituencies such as those, so that we can start putting or exerting some level of advocacy pressure to say that we want to see real benefits, real action, and real tangible change. And lastly, the other part is to start also questioning the economic models that we have embraced so far post 1994, and start asking those questions, tough ones. Are these models really working in favor of a changed political landscape and public that is now expectant of more of from the state? And the state seems to be kind of impeded in its ability to really meet these expectations. Should we be rethinking perhaps a more social market kind of an economic model that allows free entrepreneurism with a minimum state participation, and the state just provides for those perhaps that cannot be engaged actively, like the elderly and the sick in our community and the unemployed, so that perhaps it gives the greater public capacity to engage with the market directly and explore their potential and capabilities, rather than dependent wholly on the state to provide economic impetus to what seems to be right now like a failed project. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Paul. Sanisha, what are your sort of closing thoughts in relation to the continued advocacy and tracking of all of the SoNA promises, but also what level of vigilance we need to expect from the cross-section of civil society movements?
Let me start off with this point, Brian, and that is civil society advocacy, fact-checking, keeping government on its toes is quite vibrant in South Africa. I think South Africa, in the immediate period after 94, you had a very vibrant, a very kind of enriched civil society engagement in terms of democratic processes and tracking the democratic values and systems. I mean, we wouldn't have been able to do the things that we did without civil society shining the light in dark spaces and asking awkward questions. And that created a reaction by the state, to try and curb that kind of space. But it didn't deter civil society. You still see the activism of civil society. And I think we've got to keep nurturing that activism through the DDP. And perhaps what is interesting for me is that a lot of the civil society groups have now evolved. If you take something like Treat and Action Campaign, they've now branched into several different types of activist and advocacy groups. You've got Equal Education, they have the Ground Up model, they even have the kind of social justice health initiative, which is tracking the vaccine issues. So you've got these civic organizations at the grassroots, and I think they are monitoring it. There's Black Sash, there's the gender movement, there's Section 27, and of course you've got the Citizen Maverick on Daily Maverick. So you've got all of these spaces which offer an important intervention, if not insight into what government is doing. So government, as much as it's trying to hide behind certain maybe legislation around access to information, etc., if you look at the promotion of access to information act, and you look at the analysis of that, everything that comes before Parliament is actually in the public domain. You can actually access, except of course if it's in the Intelligence Committee and so forth. So I think that activism must continuously be supported, and I think the DDP could be done in a way where they can actually have what Paul was suggesting is you can have the alternative State of the Nation address, which is the civil society State of the Nation address, but you can also have civil society to come back and do an analysis and say, this is what we tracked over the last 12 years, so last year rather, and this is what has been kept as promises, this is what has been delivered, this is where the delivery should be, this is where the challenges are. So I think if you get together a collective group of civil society activists, advocacy institutions that are monitoring key social economic aspects of society, and you track it against the President's State of the Nation address, then you can actually have an incredible monitor, a barometer that actually sets up a tracking that says, hello, Mr. President, whoever you are, or hello, Mrs. President, whoever you are, this is what you haven't delivered on. This is where your party has fell short. The last point I want to make here is that we should be tracking this model that President Ramaphosa has introduced called the district development model, which is used as a basis to say we're going to fast track service delivery at the district level, at the municipality level. Now, that model needs to be unpacked, because what it can do is that it can create district mayors. Now, I don't know how this works, but district mayors could actually end up becoming super mayors. And then you end up with who's in the district model development model architecture. So we end up with the same issue where we're trying to create a model that says we're going to fast track service delivery, but it's going to be hijacked by people who may see it as another cash cow, or to get into that process because, you know what, I want to be a district mayor in this context. So I think the barometer I'm suggesting for DDP to do is to do a SoNA barometer where civil society groups are coming in and saying these things have not been delivered on in the last year and a half or year or whatever. I'll stop there.
Is it my turn, Brian? Brian, I cannot hear you, but I will continue assuming that others can hear me. As you heard, the chickens are really not happy with the State of the Nation address. When we look at the models that the president is trying to introduce, we must bear in mind that the state cannot outperform
Coco,
therefore, it's one thing.
I think we missed you. You had said the state cannot outperform.
Oh, what I said is that the state cannot outperform the quality of people and politicians deployed to it.
Mm.
And what that means is that you can re-engineer your models and your structures, but without the requisite quality of people and politicians deployed, those models will not deliver optimally. And secondly, I think we must be thankful. We must thank the universe for small mercies. In this State of the Nation address, there was no sloganeering about the fourth industrial revolution, because that's what tends to happen when our politicians talk about the fourth industrial revolution. They talk in terms that are uncritical about the dangers of techno-rationality. A techno-rationality that ignores the fact that 1.7 billion people around the world are not even in the second industrial revolution. And some of them are on this continent. But when it comes to the role of civil society, I think it is important, first of all, for citizens, particularly women, given what I said earlier, to think of themselves as policy initiators. And they must be treated and seen as such. In other words, in the 12 months prior to the next State of the Nation address, the citizen and civil society must initiate conversations, critical conversations about the content of the next State of the Nation address. It must not be our fate to every year wait for the ruling party and the president and those around them to dictate and do so alone the content of the State of the Nation address, which means, therefore, during the 12 months leading up to the next State of the Nation address, as civil society, what we must do, working with communities, we must make sure that communities are able themselves to act as policy initiators and must have the capacity to identify gaps between what is being promised and what is being actually promised by the government. So unless we as citizens, unless we as civil society act as policy initiators, we will not be able, we will always rely on the failed capacity of Parliament to perform its oversight function. But let me close with this. We must be vigilant and make sure that the state politicians, particularly those in the ruling party, particularly those in government, do not use the COVID-19 crisis as a pretext to narrow down the democratic space. And we must be vigilant to make sure that they do not enjoin technology in such an agenda. In other words, one of the greatest threats globally and nationally we face is the possibility that the state at a global level and the state at a national level will use the COVID-19 crisis to try and shut down and narrow down the democratic space to the detriment of democratic engagement between the citizen and those who are deployed in the state. Thank you, Brian.
So, Koko, thank you very much to both yourself and Sanisha for those insights for today, and to thank you very much to the Mail and Guardian for the partnership in co-hosting this engagement. We want to thank all of the participants who were able to stick it through with us, and hope that you were able to gain in one way or the other some, and at least refresh your memory as to what it is that SoNA was able to deliver to us. Of course, the report of this engagement, as well as the recording, will be shared with the attendees by tomorrow, if not later on during the week. And we do look forward to hosting you and engaging with you at a future engagement. On behalf of the Executive Director, who is here, Dr. Paul Kariuki, staff, and the funders of the DDP for this specific engagement, Conrad Adenauer Foundation, we do wish our best, and we thank you very much for your participation. We do look forward to engaging you in future as well. Have a good one.
Thank you so much.